My name is Larry Alex Taunton. I'm an author, columnist, and executive director of the Fixed Point Foundation. In the mid-1990s, when I was a graduate student studying history, specifically European history, Russian history, and Marxism, people would say to me that this was a dead end. I mean, the Berlin Wall had fallen by this time. The Soviet Union had collapsed. And yet, here we are now seeing Marxism infiltrate segments of our own society. So I thought it might be helpful to explain to you what Marxism is. What is Marxism? Prussian political theorist and revolutionary Karl Marx didn't invent the idea of socialism any more than Planned Parenthood invented abortion. But each put their own evil stamp on these practices. Socialism, which may be loosely defined as the equitable redistribution of wealth, has no absolute beginning. Marxism is Marx's particular variation on the theme. His contributions to socialism were chiefly in systematizing it, popularizing it, and militarizing it. Just as Darwin saw in guided biological processes at work in natural history, Marx likewise believed that impersonal economic forces were driving human history. History would move irresistibly from one economic stage to another until it reached the utopian socialist stage called communism. Marx called these mysterious evolutionary forces of history dialectical materialism. To help these forces along, Marx declared that workers of the world must unite and overthrow the ruling classes in violent revolution. But such revolts were few in number and were easily defeated by their respective governments. And Marx, who was rightly seen as an instigator, was expelled from half the countries of Europe. In 1849, he moved to London. There he found a labor force that had been calling for socialism in one form or another long before anyone had ever heard of Karl Marx. Full of revolutionary fire, Marx preached his famous message of bloody revolution in the expectation that the laborers, called proletarians in Marx speak, would rise up and burn the country to the ground. But it didn't happen. British laborers, though receptive to Marx on many levels, were largely uninterested in Marxism. It wasn't that socialism had no appeal to them. It did. Rather, they rejected the violence Marx demanded. They hoped to achieve their goals via democratic means. They had good reason to be hopeful. A series of parliamentary reform measures saw both improved working conditions and the expansion of the electorate. Furthermore, a robust, Bible-centered Christianity flourished in Britain in a way it simply did not in continental Europe. When asked the name of the person he most detested, Marx's equally fanatical colleague, Friedrich Engels, said, Spurgeon. This was a telling reference to the great Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon, who regularly drew London audiences of more than 10,000. Royalty and proletarians alike were drawn to his straightforward messages of forgiveness, hope, and meaning to be found in the person of Jesus Christ. Engels well understood that a people who possess these things do not, as a rule, overthrow governments. But it wasn't just Spurgeon. This was also the Britain of William Booth's juggernaut, the Salvation Army, which pioneered large-scale Christian benevolence. The Christian faith of the working class went far to satisfy the needs of the soul. These simply were not a people possessed of the revolutionary spirit that Marx demanded. Embittered, Marx broke with socialists in Britain while continuing to predict a workers' uprising in the industrialized countries of the West until his death in 1883. But it didn't happen. Enter Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci. Marx's prediction of revolution led to disillusionment among subsequent Marxists who awaited that day the way Heaven's Gate cult members awaited the Hale-Bopp comet. While languishing in one of Mussolini's prisons, the dwarfish Gramsci filled a series of secret notebooks with his own Marxist ideas. Among them, an explanation for Marx's failed prophecy of a coming proletarian uprising against the ruling classes. According to Gramsci, Marx had grossly underestimated the strength of Western society. In 1917 Russia, an armed insurrection had worked because the state and its primary institutional support, the Russian Orthodox Church, were weak and rotten. One swift kick had brought them tumbling down. In Gramsci's view, The West, chiefly Britain and America, were different. The diminutive Italian spoke in terms of hegemonies, that is, of power structures, where Marx divided the world into a single hegemony of haves and have-nots. Gramsci divided it into more hegemonies: families, education, government, morality, the church, law, and civil society as a whole. The frontal assault strategy would not work in the West, he said, at least not in the beginning, because these institutional pillars of Western society were much too strong. These must be undermined from within first, softening them up, and only then, when the Western colossus was sufficiently weakened, would the frontal assault work. Gramsci's strategy was in effect that of the Trojan horse. Socialism will triumph, he wrote, by first capturing the culture via infiltration of the schools, universities, churches, and the media by transforming the consciousness of society. The Trojan horse approach is called cultural Marxism. Subvert families, traditional morality, and the touchstones of national identity, and penetrate educational institutions, the church, and the legal system, and eventually that country will fall like a ripe fruit into the hands of Marxists. It wasn't until the 1950s that Gramsci's notebooks, which had been smuggled out of the prison, were published posthumously in Italian. It was another 20 years before they were published in English translation. By then, with multiple Marxist genocides and all, one might have thought that the evils of the system were so well established that no one in their right mind would ever again think of implementing them. But leftists are not ones to give up on a murderous, unworkable, failed utopian ideology simply because it is a murderous, unworkable, failed utopian ideology. And Gramsci's notebooks breathed new life into Marxist hopefuls. By the 1980s, Gramsci's ideas had achieved something of a cult status among a generation of Western academics. The degree to which Gramsci's infiltration tactics have worked needs little commentary from me. The left began occupying powerful positions in, if not outright control of, each of the aforementioned societal pillars. Marxists were sure that the much anticipated revolution was near. But it didn't happen. This brings us to our own time and two pernicious additions to this toxic Marxist cocktail: critical race theory and intersectionality. Whether you have ever heard of these terms or not, you have seen them at work in such seismic cultural events as the legalization of gay marriage, the Me Too movement, and the violence of Black Lives Matter that is being endorsed by the Democratic Party. Marx saw workers as oppressed people. Gramsci and a group of Marxist scholars in what was then called the Frankfurt School expanded the list of oppressed peoples to include many others. For example, traditional marriage and family are patriarchal institutions and are, therefore, instruments of oppression. The church, with its message of peace and otherworldly bliss, oppresses the masses by sapping them of their revolutionary spirit. Educational institutions oppress the lower classes by teaching them to love their countries and instilling them with patriotic fervor, thus protecting the ruling classes. And so the argument went with every other pillar of society. You must remember that the Trojan horse strategy, that is, cultural Marxism, is to infiltrate these pillars and to destroy them from within. Convincing some in these institutions that they are actually suffering oppressed victims is an effective way to do it. In the 1980s, Kimberly Crenshaw, a legal scholar who coined the terms critical race theory and intersectionality, applied Gramsci's hegemony's model to race, arguing that black people are victims of white hegemony, white supremacy, or what is sometimes called white privilege. Are you black? You're oppressed, whether you know it or not. Are you white? You're an oppressor, whether you know it or not. Crenshaw argued that America is guilty of systemic racism. Sound familiar? Because, she claimed, racism is deeply ingrained in every aspect of society. A civil war to free the oppressed, constitutional amendments to protect them, affirmative action to jumpstart them, and a multitude of government programs to help them are not enough. Nothing will ever be enough. If a black man or woman fails to succeed in America, it cannot be the result of his or her own choices or limitations. It is always the fault of a racist system. And if you're white, you are part of a racist system, and you must be made to pay for your sin. Literally. Critical race theory is being used to pave the way for massive reparations for slavery because it overcomes, not logically but emotionally, the chief hurdle facing those demanding such reparations: how to make white people of today co-conspirators in the crime of an institutional slavery that ended more than 150 years ago. As you might have guessed, intersectionality expands the definition of victims until it now includes anyone who isn't a straight Christian conservative white male. At the intersection of society, she says, one finds that women are victims of men. Non-heterosexuals are victims of heteronormativity. Non-Christians are victims of Christian hegemony. Non-Americans are victims of Americans, and on it goes. The form taken by modern Marxism sees society in terms of victims and victimizers. It has often been said that Marxism can never work because it fails to understand human nature. There's much truth in this. That said, Marxists have proved to be astute, if cynical, observers of human nature to this extent. First, contrary to what is frequently alleged, Marxism, much more than capitalism, appeals to our greedy natures because it says that what is yours should be mine. Indeed, I have a right to take it by force if necessary. Second, Marxism appeals to our desire to tell other people what to do. Legalism is not a product of religion. It's a product of human nature. And Marxist societies, secular to their black-hearted core, are the very picture of legalism, making as they do a tyranny of community. Third, Marxists know that it isn't hard to convince a man that his own failures are the result of someone else's treachery. Hitler convinced an entire country. Now Black Lives Matter would do it to America. The evil in this cannot be overstated. It's the sort of warped logic that progresses from a soft persecution to pogroms and eventually to the gas chambers. Remember the game Jenga? Players remove wooden blocks from a tower until the integrity of the structure is compromised and it collapses. Every step in the ideological genealogy of Black Lives Matter is designed to remove those blocks that support government and society, religion, tradition, patriotism, education, and so on, until a tipping point is reached and a Marxist seizure of power is possible. It's a tried and true formula. Just look at history. Dozens of lesser towers have already fallen into total Marxist ruin. Albania, Angola, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Benin, Bosnia, Bulgaria, Cambodia, China, Congo, Croatia, Cuba, Czechoslovakia, Estonia, Ethiopia, East Germany, Hungary, Laos, Latvia, Macedonia, Moldova, Montenegro, Mozambique, North Korea, Poland, Romania, Russia, Slovakia, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Ukraine, Uzbekistan, Venezuela, and Vietnam. And this is just a list I made off the top of my head on a napkin. None of these are or were what one might call models of freedom, prosperity, and stability. And yet this is what the neo-Marxists would give us under the guise of social justice. But don't be naive. This isn't about social justice. It's a pretext for injustice. It's about the weaponizing of a fictional guilt for the seizure of assets and power. Revelation 6:8 says, "And I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and his name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him." With a body count of more than 125 million in the 20th century alone, one might reasonably wonder if this is a reference to Marxism. Whether it is or not, only time itself will tell. Regardless, history has demonstrated all too well that death and hell follow that murderous worldview wherever it goes. In conclusion, let me answer a question that I've been asked many times. Historically speaking, why has the United States proved so resistant to Marxism when so much of the rest of the world has fallen prey to it? The answer is simple: Christianity. America has the largest Christian population in the world, and Christians have generally recognized Marxism's inherent godlessness. For their own part, Marxists recognize that Christianity is the key Jenga block supporting the whole of American society, and America in turn is the key Jenga block supporting what remains of the free world. To quote T.S. Eliot, if Christianity goes, the whole culture goes.